fellow panelists on the dais, Mr. D.N. Prasad, Mr. S.K. Chaudhary, Mr. Dr. Ashok Haldia, and Venkatesh Raman Prasad. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject has in fact briefly been introduced by Mr. Dutt, who spoke about the various problems that we are facing with regard to coal. Well, to begin with, it is a matter of, to say that it's a matter of serious concern, and we have expressed it. In fact, I have expressed it quite often, that in a country where you have almost 290 to 300 billion tons of coal reserves, we are not able to meet the local demand, which is not even 1 billion tons. And we are constantly importing and increasing our imports day by day. This obviously lends itself to the argument that there is something seriously lacking or missing in terms of local production. Now, so that did cover a few things regarding evacuation of coal. We often have been hearing that this is one of the major bottlenecks in the production of the mineral. And at many places, the major coal producer, Coal India, suppresses its production because it cannot evacuate the coal. Second issue, which has been often talked about in terms of local production, is of course on environment and forest and getting land and settling people who are affected. Well, I think today we don't get into that argument, but we look at logistics and the matter relating to coal evacuation. If we are to move, say if we take last year's figures, there was Coal India produced something like 462 million tons. Others produced maybe another 100 million tons. It was 575 million tons being the total production, of which, if we go by, if we just take Coal India as a subset, not look at others, then we have a scenario where transportation by rail is somewhat reducing, which is a worrying issue. Transportation by road is increasing, but then one has to see it very critically, whether road transport can really be to some extent a substitute to rail or not, and if so, whether this has been fully exploited. What I heard some months ago was that, having seen or realized the limitations of rail transport, and because of various reasons, we can get into it a little later, some of the power producers in East Chhattisgarh, or I think also, I'm not sure about Orissa, but at least Chhattisgarh, have even ventured out to go in for a bit of road transport to evacuate coal on their own, which was a fairly welcome kind of a step. When we look around the world, we find that coal is moved in road also for long distances, as far as 80 to 90, maybe 100 kilometers. But then you need certain types of vehicles that can carry much more higher load. You need roads that can probably be better. This is also not a possibility which should be ruled out. As compared to rail transport in other countries, we are still lacking, both in terms of infrastructure and in terms of capacities. When we look at Australia or US, or particularly these two countries, we find that each rake could carry even up to 10,000 tons, which were almost having 100 wagons carrying 100 tons each with 4 locomotives dragging the train. And in the US particularly, we almost find that there are dedicated corridors for freight and fast movement of coal takes place. Now, this is an example which one would like to see being emulated in this country to evacuate coal faster. I am told that in the Eastern Coal Corridor which is coming up, these issues are being taken care of into introduction of higher capacity wagons and higher capacity trains. That is, maybe you have a larger number of rakes with larger capacities, and maybe you go up to 7,000, 8,000 tons per rake. But it is still to come in. But let us for a time being look at the current situation. When we talk of 462 million tons of coal being transported, of it I think 48 or almost maybe about, if you go roughly 50% is moved by rail. Then if you remove that which is going through merry-go-rounds, we are left with an average of about 200, 210 rakes per day. If we are looking at expansion, say in the next year, we are looking at an additional production of 45 million tons, in the current year rather. 45 million tons, if you go by the same ratios, you are really asking for another 20, 25 rakes in addition to what you have today, which is approximately about 10 to 11% increase in rake capacity every year. And this kind of thing will continue. As you said, 2016-17, if you go by the same capacities, you're asking for something like 260 to 70 rakes for Coal India alone per day. Are we in a position to do that? Well, the railways have their limited capacities, but I think what is needed is a combined effort on both sides. Way back when I was still in the ministry, and even thereafter, and being associated with Coal India, there is one factor which unfortunately gets slightly lesser importance but can make some difference even within the powers of the company, is to look at existing sidings and look at those sidings which have been either gone into disuse or not being used, reviving them so that capacity for loading can be increased. I saw one example in Mahanadi coalfield where the loading from a mine which had adequate coal was about 3 or 4 rakes per day. All that the company had to do was to create a loop line and a wharf wall and increase the capacity from 3 to 6. And tie up with the railways so that more rakes are available. Yes, there is a problem perhaps of the rolling stock, but then rolling stock availability can be increased in 2 ways. One is by introduction of more wagons. The other is by reducing the turnaround time. Both efforts are required to ensure that more rakes are made available. But it is a fact that there is a constraint, and if that constraint is not worked out within the next 2-3 years, perhaps 2016-17 will be highly problematic. I am presuming that Coal India will achieve the targets it is hoping to. But there again, there are limitations that relate to forest and environment. We are hoping that the new government, there will be some speed up on that. Coming to the issue of imports, imports have jumped. In 2012-13, I think it was around 135 million tons. It has jumped to about 160 in the last year. Whether all that extra thing has gone to power, I'm still not very sure. When you talk about it in terms of figures, we get a figure saying something like 65 million tons is for power and the rest is not. To my mind, that is not entirely correct, because you have 30 to 35 million tons of coking coal. Where is the rest gone? I wonder whether cement has used so much, whether sponge iron has used so much. Yes, there are a number of traders who are working in the field and bringing coal, and they are also selling to a significant extent to the power plants, which doesn't appear in the statistics as going to power. So I have a feeling that the quantities to power may perhaps be a little more than just 65 million tons, which is the figure being quoted at many situations. Even if we are looking at about 160 million tons of coal being evacuated from ports today. This may go up to maybe 200 million tons in the next year or two. It's quite possible because of the lack of growth in coal production internally, which right in the beginning I said is the biggest bane of this place. If we look at the increase in imports and its a demand on port capacity as well as rail evacuation, I think what had been said right in the beginning is quite correct. That port capacity, why it has been planned out, whether that will come into being to allow, of course, the advantage on ports is that you can shift commodities from one to the other, but perhaps dedicated, what do you call these, yards or whatever, or lines for coal may now be required, because if there is a stream of coal supply into the country through import, then that port would require almost dedicated facilities. That has to be kept in mind. There is a problem within the ports for rail connection. This is a purely administrative issue. As far as the ports are concerned, they have good connections as far as rail is concerned. It is a purely administrative issue as to how the transfer takes place when the rake moves out from the port jurisdiction into the railway jurisdiction. This is a matter which requires, you don't have to, it's not rocket science, it's something very simple which needs to be sorted out by sitting across the table. We had this issue raised, but I'm still not very sure whether this has been fully sorted out. The rise in the number of rakes requirement, that is the rolling stock addition for import, is obviously clear. If we are going to have 20-30 million tons of coal coming in to the country every year additional, then if we go by at least 60% of, or rather 50% of it moving out to far off places in rakes, then it is an addition which is additional capacities which are needed. I think these issues need to be debated and need to be discussed in detail. To wind up, I would just like to comment upon the import of coal itself. When we see the international locations where coal exists, for India, it's South Africa, Australia, Indonesia. It's not US. US is too far away. US is supplying coal mainly to Europe. South America has coal, but again it goes parts to Europe, parts elsewhere. It hardly comes to the eastern side. Now when we are looking at coal resources that are closest to the nation, it's Australia, New Zealand and South Africa. We have an imbalance on the ports in this country. Why the shipping ministry or the others do not pay attention to it, I really can't understand. Why there are limitations on the western coast and there are more ports on the eastern coast, but then I find NTPC coming to importing coal and bringing into the western coast to supply coal to the plants in the east, which was mentioned by the minister himself on one of the occasions. This is a very, there's a lot of rationalization that needs to be done. Why western coast can't get more ports is something which I have not been able to understand. Why eastern coast, which has ports, is not getting the coal, except for Haldia maybe, and maybe Vizag, Tamil Nadu, and a few other private ports that have come up along the coasts, have planned very large capacities and they are still not being fully exploited. I think there's a large number of topics that you have picked up here, starting from the domestic problems as well as running itself into other issues like acquisition of assets abroad and pricing and so and so. Just a word about acquisitions abroad. Both public and private companies have gone into these ventures in the past. Public sector has not been successful to the extent it was desired by the government. The Coal India has got one asset in Mozambique. It is not turning out to be very promising. ICVL is a company that was meant to do this, has not moved very much. It is trying to acquire another one mine in Mozambique, trying to buy it from Rio Tinto. I wonder why Rio Tinto wants to sell it. ICVL needs to examine that first before putting its hand on it. We have seen the examples of acquisition of coal in Indonesia and Australia. Indonesia is not been an extremely fruitful experience as far as various companies are concerned. We know the case of Tata and power plant and Mundra also. It seems that either there was lack of understanding within the government with regard to what could happen in the international market and how could governments vary their taxation laws, whether one would take advantage. If that was the case, then there was need for a safeguard against it. We run into serious problems because of that. Coming to Australia, well, if we go too deep inside the continent and want to evacuate coal from there, which I think some people are trying to do, your coal is not going to be cheap in the international market. Whether you find customers or not is going to be a major issue. Some of the analysts believe that acquiring mines in Australia deep inside with 400, 500 kilometers of rail requirement may not be economically, financially viable. Maybe they may have to do a lot of rethinking. One question is often raised about people wanting to say that why do we need to acquire mines outside when we have adequate coal in this country? I think we need to address this issue very seriously. With this note, I would like to conclude and thank InfraLine for giving me this opportunity. And thereafter, I think you will have a lot of wonderful speakers who will be talking about separate subjects on the topic. Thank you very much.